When you are done doing all your research and you've outlined your speech and you've put all of the ideas in the order that you want it, you need to also now decide how you're going to begin the speech and how you're going to end the speech. We've had some practice at that, but now we're going to be doing it more formally. The introduction is an important part of your speech, both the informative speech and the persuasive speech. And there's a number of things that you want to accomplish in that introduction. First, you want to make sure that you get the audience's attention. That does not mean that you start your speech with, "Today I'm going to talk about." That's not very interesting. You want to find another way of getting the audience's attention. We'll talk more about that in a minute. You want to let the audience know that your speech is important, that it's important to them, that you've picked a topic that they're going to find interesting and relevant to their life. You also want to let the audience know that you have a particular specific topic. And so in the introduction, towards the middle of it, you want to let them know specifically what your topic is going to be about. If you have credibility in the area that you're talking about, let the audience know in the introduction. Don't wait to the middle of the speech. It's important that the audience knows at the beginning that, in fact, you do know something about what you're talking about because you've experienced it or studied it. In some speeches, it's important to establish goodwill. We'll talk more about that later. The final part of the introduction is the preview. Here, you let the audience know what the organization of your speech is about. We'll talk more about that later also. So what are some methods for getting the audience's attention? Well, one way is by beginning the speech by relating your topic to the audience. Think of some creative way in which this topic that you are talking about has something to do with them. One way that's used by many beginning speakers is the questioning method. This is a rhetorical question that you might ask the audience. I don't think this is the best way of beginning a speech, but it's one that's used by many beginning speakers. You could also let the audience know right at the beginning why this speech is important. So you could state the importance as the attention device. You could startle the audience, demonstrate something, blow up a balloon and pop it, something that gets the audience looking at you at the beginning of the speech. Arouse the audience's curiosity with an interesting statistic that lets them know that this topic is not only important, but it involves a lot of people. You can begin with a quotation, always a good way of beginning a speech, as long as it relates to the topic that you're going to be talking about. Or you could tell a brief story. Let them get involved by letting them know that there's a story you can tell them that involves with the topic of the speech. If you have credibility, if there's something that you know or some experience that you've had, then use that in the introduction. Don't wait somewhere to the middle of the speech. The audience's perception of whether you are qualified or not, in fact, is your credibility. And so you want to establish that from the beginning. In the end, the only one that is important when it comes to credibility is the audience. The audience decides whether or not you're credible or not. But you can go a long way to convincing them that you, in fact, are a credible speaker who knows what she's talking about. What is goodwill? Well, like credibility, it's the audience's perception of whether the speaker has the best interest of the audience in mind. Does the audience believe that you are telling them things that are good for them? Now, sometimes in a persuasive speech, the audience will disagree with you. And if you feel the audience is disagreeing with your basic tenets, with your basic argument, you may, in the beginning of the speech, need to establish that goodwill. You can let the audience know at least to say, look, I know you disagree with me, but could you at least listen to my argument and use as much of an open mind as you can as I make my points. So establishing your goodwill is important, and it's important in the persuasive speech, especially when the audience is antagonistic to your point of view. The preview statement in the introductory speech is the last thing that you say in the introduction. It identifies the main points that you'll be discussing in the order that you'll be discussing them, and lets the audience know what the organization of the speech is. It also states the thesis. What is it that you are going to be telling us about, either informing us about, or the proposition, what it is that you're going to be arguing. Remember that the preview statement is always going to be at the end of the introduction. What are some things you need to remember as you develop your introduction? Well, the introduction could be very creative. One way of getting the audiences interested in your speech is being creative. You could use a visual aid as a creative way to get the audience interested in your speech in the introduction. So using a visual aid in the introduction is perfectly okay. The introduction should not go on too long, 10 to 20% of the entire speech. So if your speech is 5 minutes long, your introduction should be no longer than 50 seconds to a minute. Make sure to plan the introduction after you're done outlining the speech. You don't know what the speech is about until you're done outlining it, researching it, and so put the introduction together after you've done all of that planning. In fact, as you research, consider in the back of your mind, think about how you're going to introduce the speech. There might be some materials in the research that you can use to get your speech started. What about the conclusion? You need to consider how you're going to end the speech, and you need to plan that. The conclusion is basically made up of two parts. First, you want to signal the end of the speech by saying in conclusion or finally, or some way let the audience know with your voice that you're ending the speech. You want to reinforce the thesis, let them know what the important ideas were in the speech, maybe go over what the main points that you had in the speech. And then you want to have a final statement. Now, what are some of the things you need to be aware of as you prepare the conclusion of your speech? Well, as you do your research, look for possible concluding material, ideas that you might use in the conclusion of your speech. You want to conclude with your voice up, not down. So you don't want to end with by getting quieter, but you want to end nice and strong at the end of your speech. The speech ending should not be more than 5 to 10% of the total speech. So again, if your speech is 5 minutes long, the conclusion would run about 30 seconds to maybe 45 seconds. Work out how you're going to end the speech. This should not be something that you improv. It should be something that you plan and rehearse. Methods for ending the speech is to make sure that you summarize your speech and don't add new materials. You can end with a quote or you can end with a dramatic statement. Remember, keep your voice active, keep your voice nice and loud, and put a lot of energy into the ending of your speech. The last thing to remember is do not add new ideas at the end of the speech. The ending of the speech is for review, for emphasis, and for conclusion, not to add new ideas. Just to end up, there's two kinds of endings. One was used by Martin Luther King in many of his speeches, in which his voice got bigger, his ideas got bigger, his body had more movement, and he built the speech to a large ending. Another kind of speech is the dissolve ending, and here is where the speaker gets quieter and more intense, but in a quiet way. The speech delivered by President Reagan after the Challenger spaceship blew up on on its takeoff is an example of a dissolve ending speech.